What few people say out loud, and even fewer are clear-headed enough to face, is that your leaving does not create an immediate collapse in the narcissist's world. There is no loud breaking sound, no visible wreckage, no surface-level tragedy. Everything still appears to be functioning. They still wake up, still laugh and talk, still step into new relationships with their familiar confidence. But beneath that outer shell, a machine that once ran because of you begins to lose its rhythm. Throughout the relationship, you had become the invisible gear that kept that system from shaking. When they felt anxious, you soothed it. When they were tense, you absorbed it. When their inner world fell out of sync, you stepped in to stabilize it. No one ever asked you to do this, and there was never a single moment when you formally accepted that role. It formed gradually through every time you tolerated, every time you explained, every time you adjusted yourself to prevent yet another eruption. Through the lens of Carl Jung, this is the moment you became the container for the parts they could not or dared not carry themselves. The fear of abandonment, the sense of emptiness, the repressed anger, and the deep shame they never named. When you withdraw in silence, leaving no noise, no drama, what is taken away is not attention, but structural support. The emotions that were once pushed onto you now fall straight into the inner void. At first, they do not notice. Inertia still carries them forward, like a clock that keeps ticking for a few more turns even after the spring has run down. But then very small signs begin to appear. Irritation seeps into moments that once felt familiar. Restlessness arrives more quickly whenever they are alone. New people fail to bring the sense of rightness they expected. And most importantly, a strange feeling starts to follow them, as if the inner room has suddenly grown larger, colder, more echoing. This is when the persona can no longer seal every crack, and the shadow, as Jung described it, begins to whisper from the dark corners. You do not need to return to witness this. Your absence alone is enough to expose an uncomfortable truth. Without someone keeping the rhythm, the narcissist is forced to confront the emptiness within, something they relied on you for years to avoid seeing. After the initial phase of quiet malfunctioning, a hard-to-name state begins to take over the narcissist's inner world. It is not longing in the ordinary sense, nor is it grief, as people usually imagine when losing an important relationship. What they experience is the feeling of no longer recognizing themselves in moments that once felt familiar. In the past, every interaction with you unintentionally helped shape their identity. The way you reacted, the way you admired, the way you worried or became angry, all became data points that told them where they stood in the world. From a Jungian perspective, the narcissist persona is not built from inner understanding, but assembled from external reflections, and you were the clearest, most stable mirror among them. When that mirror disappears, they continue to play their role, but the stage begins to feel empty. They say the familiar lines, repeat the gestures that once worked, yet inside an unusual silence emerges, as if no one is left to confirm that the performance still matters. Praise from others no longer carries enough weight. New admiring glances skim the surface without ever reaching the core. They begin to feel off in the smallest situations. A conversation that no longer flows smoothly, a pause that lasts a little too long, a restlessness that appears even while they are being given attention. These are signs of an ego losing its footing. Jung described that when the persona is no longer sustained, the shadow begins to rise to the surface. For the narcissist, the shadow is not merely negative emotions, but the entire realm of primal emptiness and shame they have spent a lifetime avoiding. With no one left to absorb and reflect these feelings, they have nowhere to go and are forced to return inward. They start to examine themselves through new relationships, as though looking into a cracked mirror. The reflection distorted, lacking depth, misaligned with the memory of who they believe themselves to be. And it is this misalignment that creates a silent panic. Not panic over losing you, but panic over losing the ability to maintain the sense of who I am. In everyday life, this shows up subtly. They become more irritable when not given attention, more easily bored when things do not revolve around them, and especially uncomfortable with moments of being alone. In those moments, silence is no longer rest, but an echoing room where they are forced to hear the thoughts you once unknowingly helped quiet. You do not need to return to witness this disintegration. Your absence alone is enough to reveal a difficult truth. Without a stable mirror, the narcissist's ego does not hold together. It begins to fragment into scattered pieces, still functioning, yet desperately trying to recover an image they lost at the same time they lost you. When the phase of seeking artificial stability no longer works, the narcissist enters a more complex period where regret does not erupt but slowly seeps in through a series of small failed experiences. At this stage, they are no longer simply trying to prove that you can be replaced, but become obsessed with recreating the feeling they once had when you were there. They approach new relationships with very specific expectations, though they are never spoken aloud. The other person must provide reflection, validation, soothing, and control all at once. It is precisely here that reality begins to betray them. New partners do not understand the unspoken rules of their inner world, cannot anticipate the groundless tensions, and are not willing to take on the long-term role of emotional regulation. Conversations fall out of rhythm. Minor frictions accumulate quickly, and the other person's patience wears thin sooner than the narcissist anticipated. Each time, the narcissist does not see this as a reflection of themselves, but temporarily attributes it to circumstances, to the other person, or to incompatibility. Yet when this script repeats too many times, an uncomfortable awareness begins to surface. The problem is not the new person, but the fact that no one can hold the role you once did. From a Jungian lens, what is bound to unconscious structure and psychological compensation cannot be recreated through outward form or fleeting emotion alone. You were the one who absorbed inner fluctuations they lacked the capacity to process, and without you, those fluctuations return with increasing intensity. Regret, therefore, does not take the shape of love or moral remorse, but the sensation of losing a vital function. They begin to compare in silence, recalling moments when everything felt easier, not because you indulged them, but because you once kept their inner world from collapsing into chaos. And the more they try to recreate that with someone else, the more they confront a brutal reality. Some bonds are formed through deep adaptation to their wounds, and once such a bond is broken, it cannot be copied by simply starting over. It is at this point that regret becomes a constant burden, quiet, undramatic, yet enough to erode the sense of omnipotence they once relied on to survive. At this stage, what unfolds inside the narcissist is no longer impulsive or temporary. Regret has crossed the threshold of emotion and become a baseline state, quiet yet constantly shaping the way they exist. What is notable is that they are no longer seeking release through overt action. Instead, they live with a sense of being stuck, as though time has continued to move forward while their inner world remains frozen at a fixed point they can neither return to nor leave behind. In Carl Jung's understanding, this is the inevitable consequence when a person fails to develop the capacity for dialogue with themselves. When there is no longer anyone serving as a psychological intermediary, all conflict is forced inward into a space where they lack the tools to process it. Regret at this point no longer resembles longing or nostalgia, but becomes a persistent instability that seeps into every aspect of life. They may be talking, working, even laughing, yet underneath lies an unrelieved tension, a sense of having to brace themselves against inner reactions they never had to carry alone before. The research of Heinz Kohut, founder of self-psychology, shows that individuals with fragile narcissistic structures depend heavily on self-objects, people or relationships that help them maintain a coherent sense of self. When that self-object disappears without an equally deep replacement, the individual falls into a state of inner fragmentation, expressed through emptiness, irritability, and a loss of orientation. This explains why, at this stage, the narcissist no longer erupts violently as before, but instead becomes heavy, exhausted, and dissatisfied with life itself. Their regret does not turn outward, because they lack the inner safety required to admit fault or take responsibility. Instead, it turns inward and becomes a form of constant self-surveillance. They begin to control their own emotions tensely, afraid that if they loosen their grip even slightly, the emptiness will flood in uncontrollably. Roy Baumeister's research on ego depletion also shows that when people must continuously suppress and self-regulate without emotional replenishment, their capacity to endure drops sharply, leading to prolonged mental fatigue and a pervasive sense of meaninglessness. In the narcissist case, no longer having someone absorb their inner fluctuations pushes them into this depleted state without their understanding why. They cannot name what they feel. They only sense that everything is becoming heavier. Moments alone grow unbearable, not because of loneliness, but because there is no longer anywhere to offload their anxiety. What makes this phase feel like a prison is the absence of familiar psychological exits. They cannot return to you to re-establish the old order, because doing so would require admitting a dependency they have spent a lifetime denying. Nor can they truly attach deeply to someone new, because the fear of being seen too clearly, too nakedly, grows stronger. As a result, they are trapped in an in-between space, no longer powerful as before, yet not mature enough to transform the experience into growth. Regret is no longer something they think about. It is the way they live each day. It appears in the heaviness upon waking, in the agitation when everything is quiet, in a lingering dissatisfaction without a clear cause. This is not karma in a mystical sense, but a very real psychological consequence of living through others in order to avoid oneself. And in this state, what hurts most is not losing you, but realizing they are living with a void no one can fill for them anymore, nor can they continue to ignore it as they once did. At this point, the narcissist no longer acts from confidence or the illusion of control, but from a prolonged inner tension that has reached its limit. Smoldering regret, unresolved emptiness, and accumulated disorientation create a psychological pressure they can no longer ignore. Yet because they lack the capacity to turn inward and work through it, they resort to the only thing they know, turning outward, trying to re-engage you. This is when the final attempts to break the silence appear, not because love has awakened, but because their old reality is standing on the edge of complete collapse. At this stage, what they seek is not you, but your reaction. Even the smallest response is enough to give them information that the old bond is still alive, that they have not been fully expelled from the psychological system they once operated within. Your silence is not merely a lack of communication. It is a non-reflective zone where every manipulative effort produces no image for them to grasp. This is especially threatening to a narcissistic structure, because their ego cannot self-validate. They need others to do it for them. As the silence continues, the feeling, I no longer exist in that person's mind, begins to activate their deepest fear, invisibility. The behaviors that emerge at this stage are often extremely subtle. They are not direct apologies, nor clear admissions. Instead, they take the form of ambiguous signals, purposeless questions, actions disguised as coincidence. It may be a message with no real content, a casual reference to a shared memory that leads nowhere, or a chance appearance in a space they know you might see. What matters is not the content, but the capacity to trigger a response. The moment you react, whether with anger, confusion, or pity, they know they still have a place in your inner world. George K. Simon, in his research on covertly manipulative behavior, pointed out that individuals with strong controlling tendencies are not truly seeking reconciliation, but psychological leverage. When direct leverage no longer works, they shift to indirect strategies in order to avoid being seen as the weaker party. This explains why, at this stage, the narcissist rarely says outright, "I need you," and instead creates situations that pressure you to break your own silence. They do not want to plead, because pleading would mean admitting dependency, something that contradicts the entire defensive structure they have spent a lifetime building. Alongside this, another psychological phenomenon comes into play: behavioral escalation when reinforcement is removed. In behavioral psychology, BF, Skinner called this an extinction burst, the phase in which a behavior that was previously reinforced suddenly stops producing results, causing the individual to increase the frequency and intensity of that behavior before eventually being forced to abandon it. In their relationship with you, your emotional reactions were the greatest reward they received. When that reward disappears, their nervous system does not immediately accept the loss, but responds by pushing them to try again harder, differently, more aggressively. This is why, at this stage, their behavior can become erratic, contradictory, and even self-sabotaging in terms of their own image. What they fail to realize, however, is that each attempt that meets no response erodes the old reality a little further. Silence provides no new data, no confirmation, no opposition. It renders every strategy ineffective because there is no longer a surface for it to attach to. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the persona completely loses its ability to function. With no stage and no audience, even the most refined performance becomes meaningless. And when the persona collapses while the shadow remains unintegrated, the individual falls into a state of silent panic. At this stage, many narcissists begin to experience a form of existential tension they have never known before. They no longer feel omnipotent, but they also do not know how to become real. Thoughts of you do not appear as a desire to return, but as a lost reference point, a time marker when everything was not as chaotic as it is now. What hurts most is that they cannot share this feeling with anyone. To speak it aloud would expose a vulnerability they lack the inner language to tolerate. And so they continue to wrestle in silence, simultaneously seeking contact and fearing being seen through. The key point here is this: not every effort is meant to return, but every effort is meant to break the silence. When they no longer receive any reaction, an unavoidable truth begins to form. The old reality is dead, and there is no way to resurrect it through manipulation or strategy. This is the moment many people call letting go, but in reality, it is not release, it is retreat for self-preservation. They withdraw, not because they have understood, but because continuing to collide with silence only wounds them further. This withdrawal is often mistaken for peace, but inwardly it is a frozen state. There is no transformation, no integration, only a pause to avoid pain. And it is here that your role is completed fully, without your participation. Your silence does not force them to change, but it does not allow them to continue as before. It places them before a non-negotiable reality. Either they face themselves, or they continue living within an empty, lifeless structure where every relationship becomes a fading copy of something already lost. What matters most for you at this stage is not understanding what they are thinking, but recognizing that any response from you pulls you back into a structure that is already dead. Silence is not a weapon, nor is it a victory. It is simply the final boundary between an old reality built on manipulation and a new reality in which you no longer serve as the regulator of someone else's disorder. And when that boundary is held, whatever happens next, whether they remain stuck or begin to confront themselves, is no longer your responsibility. After the phase of attempting to break the silence and being forced to retreat, a particular state forms in the narcissist's psychological life: silent obsession. This stage is easily misunderstood from the outside. There are no more messages, no more appearances, no obvious behaviors suggesting an attempt to return. Everything looks finished. But in truth, inside them, the story has not closed. What ends is action, not psychological attachment. What must be understood here is this: when they stop chasing, it is not because they have accepted losing you, but because they no longer have any tools to influence you. Your prolonged silence has rendered every strategy meaningless. There is no reaction to analyze, no emotion to exploit, no data to locate themselves by. So instead of continuing to collide with a non-responsive wall, they shift to another familiar mechanism, keeping you alive internally, while not daring to approach you in reality. According to Carl Jung, when a relationship based on projection is abruptly severed without conscious withdrawal, the image of the other does not disappear, it becomes frozen in the unconscious. In this case, you are no longer a real person with an independent life, but a psychological symbol, a symbol of the time when they still felt they had form, position, and impact. This explains why, even without contact, they continue to think about you in highly unrealistic ways, sometimes idealizing, sometimes resenting, but rarely seeing you as an independent person who has moved on into a different life. At this stage, their inner world operates within a prolonged contradiction. On one hand, they cannot return, because you are no longer positioned to be drawn back into the old loop. On the other hand, they cannot fully let go, because doing so would mean accepting that the old reality has collapsed permanently. So they keep you at a safe distance in their mind, close enough to avoid confronting emptiness, far enough to avoid the pain of rejection once more. This is the state many analysts refer to as psychological haunting, an obsession that cannot be resolved, but also cannot continue. Otto Kernberg's research on narcissistic personality structure shows that when an important attachment object is lost without the capacity for emotional integration, the individual tends to split the experience into two extremes: idealization in memory and nullification in reality. This means that in daily life, they may behave as though you no longer exist, while in their inner world, your image carries disproportionate weight. You become an unspoken point of comparison for every subsequent relationship, even though they never admit it. The consequence of this state is prolonged psychological stagnation. They may continue living, meeting people, and building new images, but they lose the capacity for deep attachment. Anyone who comes afterward is placed at a disadvantage, forced to compete with an image that no longer exists in reality, but remains powerful in the unconscious. This creates a new cycle of disappointment, in which they repeatedly feel that something is missing, incomplete, or not like before, without being able to identify why. More importantly, at this stage, regret has mutated. It is no longer a sharp pain, but an unnamed melancholic undertone, a sense that something fundamental in their life has gone off course, yet cannot be corrected through surface effort. And because they lack the habit of turning inward to process experience, this feeling does not lead to transformation, but to deeper avoidance. Meanwhile, for you, this is often the stage when inner freedom begins to stabilize. You are no longer pulled by the question, what are they thinking? Because the prolonged silence itself has already given you the clearest answer. Whatever remains is beyond your influence. You do not need to witness the obsession for it to exist, and you do not need to be the lesson for them to mature. At this point, the two paths have fully diverged. You continue living in your own reality, while they continue living with a memory that cannot be returned to, repaired, or fully released. There is a moment undramatic, quiet, without the shape of tragedy, that marks the deepest fracture in the narcissist's psychological experience. The realization that you did not merely leave, but now truly exist outside their orbit. This is not when they stop contacting you, nor when they stop thinking about you. It is the moment they understand that no matter how much they think, remember, or reinterpret the story, you are living in a reality that no longer needs them to define who you are. Before this, even in silence, even without return, there remained an unspoken assumption within them that you were still somewhere on the outer ring of their world, still influenced, still carrying traces of the old bond. This assumption allowed them to preserve a final sense of control, even if only in imagination. Then, one day, information slips in through an ordinary channel. You are calm, you are stable, you are no longer revolving around the old story. You do not need to display happiness or prove anything. Simply no longer reflecting them is enough. And that very ordinariness shatters the last illusion. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when projection is forced to withdraw, not because they choose to, but because the projected object no longer remains still to carry it. When someone no longer resonates with a projection, the projected image loses its anchor and collapses back into the unconscious of the one projecting. This creates a deeply uncomfortable inner collision. They can no longer hold you as a symbol serving their ego structure. You are no longer the one who left them, the one who did not understand them, or the one who will regret it. You are simply someone who moved on without needing them to exist in the story. This moment is rarely expressed through action, but through a subtle shift in how they experience the world. The stories they once told about you no longer feel solid. The memories they used for self-soothing now feel misplaced. And most importantly, they begin to sense the imbalance clearly. You are living in the present, while they are stuck with a version of the past that no one else shares. This is when they confront a truth that is hard to swallow. You are no longer part of their psychological structure, and that cannot be reversed by effort or strategy. For the narcissist, this is the deepest form of loss, because it does not allow them to remain central. They cannot cast you as the loser, nor keep you as a latent source of energy. You have become an independent reality, and that independence exposes what they have always avoided, that the world continues to function, even when they are no longer the point of reference. Otto Kernberg described this as the moment when the narcissistic ego confronts the limits of omnipotence, where the individual is forced to acknowledge that they no longer have the power to control those who once mattered. Importantly, this moment does not automatically lead to maturity. For a very small number of individuals, it may become the starting point for turning inward and confronting the shadow. But for most, it leads only to a new form of adaptation, shrinking their world, avoiding deep attachments, and continuing to live within a safer but emotionally poorer structure. You are no longer there as a mirror, and they no longer have the courage to seek another one that is deep enough for you. This moment often goes unnoticed at first. You do not feel victorious, nor do you feel vengeful. You simply notice that the questions that once haunted you have quietly fallen away. There is no longer a need to understand what they are thinking, no urge to close the story with words. You realize that separation was completed not when they let go, but when you no longer existed in their inner world as a living point of reference. And that is the true ending, not the end of a relationship, but the end of a psychological structure that once bound you to stabilizing someone else's inner disorder. From this moment on, you are no longer absent. You are fully present in your own life. And they, whatever they may think, are forced to accept a reality in which you are no longer at the center, the reality they have always feared most. There is a moment undramatic, quiet, without the shape of tragedy, that becomes the deepest fracture in a narcissist's psychological experience. The moment they realize you did not merely leave, but truly exist outside their orbit. This is not when they stop reaching out, nor when they stop thinking about you. It is the moment they understand that no matter how much they think, remember, or reinterpret the story, you are living in a reality that no longer needs them to define who you are. Before that, even in silence, even without your return, an unspoken assumption still lives inside them, that you remain on the outer ring of their world, still affected, still carrying traces of the old bond. That assumption allows them to preserve a final sense of control, even if only in imagination. But then one day information slips in through an ordinary channel. You are calm, you are stable, you no longer revolve around the old story. You do not need to display happiness or prove anything. Simply no longer reflecting them is enough. And it is precisely that ordinariness that shatters the last illusion. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment projection is forced to withdraw, not because they want it to, but because the object of projection is no longer standing still to carry it. When someone no longer resonates with a projection, the projected image loses its anchor and collapses back into the unconscious of the one projecting. This creates a deeply uncomfortable inner collision. They can no longer hold you as a symbol that serves their ego structure. You are no longer the one who left them, the one who didn't understand them, or the one who will regret it. You are simply someone who moved on without needing them to exist in the story. This moment rarely shows itself through action, but through a silent shift in how they experience the world. The stories they once told about you no longer feel certain. The memories they used to soothe themselves now feel out of place. And most importantly, they begin to sense the imbalance clearly. You are living in the present, while they are stuck with a version of the past that no one else shares. This is when they face a truth that is hard to swallow. You are no longer part of their psychological structure, and that cannot be reversed by effort or strategy. For a narcissist, this is the deepest form of loss, because it does not allow them to remain central. They cannot cast you as the loser, nor keep you as a latent source of energy. You have become an independent reality, and that independence exposes what they have always avoided. That the world continues to function even when they are no longer the point of reference. Otto Kernberg described this as the moment when the narcissistic ego confronts the limits of omnipotence, where the individual is forced to admit that they no longer have the power to shape the people who once mattered. Yet what matters is that this moment does not automatically lead to maturity. For a very small number of people, it can become the starting point for turning inward and facing the shadow. But for most, it only leads to a new form of adaptation. They shrink their world, avoid deep attachments, and continue living within a structure that feels safer but is emotionally poorer. You are no longer there to serve as a mirror, and they no longer have the courage to find another mirror deep enough. For you, this moment often goes unnoticed at first. You do not feel victorious, and you do not feel vengeful. You simply notice that the questions that once haunted you have fallen away on their own. There is no longer a need to understand what they are thinking, no longer an urge to close the story with words. You realize that separation was completed not when they let go, but when you no longer existed in their inner world as a living point of reference. And that is the true ending. Not the end of a relationship, but the end of a psychological structure that once bound you to stabilizing someone else's inner disorder. From this moment on, you are no longer absent. You are fully present in your own life. And they, whatever they may think, are forced to accept a reality in which you are no longer at the center, the very reality they have always feared most.